with these tariffs, I mean, there's talk that there could be a recession down the road. And, I think a lot of it's going to come down to how the market reacts to Trump's tariff agenda and how far Trump goes on the tariff front.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by economics reporter Zach Halaschak. Zach, a couple years ago, we started hearing the inflation word, which we hadn't really heard very much about in the past 40 years. Now there's a new term from the 70s and 80s that we're starting to hear again, and that's stagflation. Yep. What's that, and what's going on with that?
Well, we're starting to hear a little bit more about it because we've been hearing ad nauseum about inflation since, it really started popping up about 2 or 3 years ago. But now, but with that inflation, we always had positive GDP growth. So the economy was expanding, unemployment was relatively low, and in some cases historically low. So other economic factors were not stagnating, and they were doing well while inflation was causing, consumers pain. Now we have this issue where inflation is still too high. Now it's not what it was running, a couple of years ago when it was up to 8-9% in June 2022. But it's still over the 2% goal that the Fed has set, something running like 2.7, 2.8% now. And it's not really projected to fall that much this year. So we're going to have a scenario where inflation throughout 2025 is going to remain relatively slightly elevated, but enough to be felt. But we're starting to see projections that GDP, so economic output, is starting to slow. They're kind of across the board right now, all over the place. But it doesn't look like we're going to be able to maintain this 2+% GDP growth all year. And so when you have slowing economic growth plus higher inflation, that's kind of where you get the word stagflation. So economic stagnation and inflation. We're not really seeing projections that there's going to be a huge uptick in unemployment. I think the Fed projected a slight uptick in unemployment before the end of the year, something like 4.3%, 4.4%, somewhere in that range. But that's nowhere near like massive recession material. But still, with these tariffs, I mean, there's talk that there could be a recession down the road. And, I think a lot of it's going to come down to how the market reacts to Trump's tariff agenda and how far Trump goes on the tariff front.
And there have been different forecasts, right, where some have been projecting slowing of growth. Some people have never been happy with 2% growth in and of itself. And then there are some that are projecting, at least temporarily, a contraction.
Yeah, I think the biggest one you were seeing was the GDP Now by the Atlanta Federal Reserve. They actually added kind of an addendum to that now and said, when you take out import data, and I think it was something with gold, it's now slightly positive, but marginally so. I think it's like 1% or less positive. But still, that's not good when you have politicians who want more than 2% GDP growth, but to see it below that's not good. And then also just to see it slowing whenever economic output is moving in the wrong direction, while inflation is staying too high, it's never welcome news to economists.
So back in the 80s when they were fixing stagflation, we used to talk about rock and roller cola wars.
Yes.
Now our soda wars have to do with the SNAP program. Talk a little bit about what some policymakers would like to see happen in terms of what people can get with their food stamps.
Well, so the idea that some have is, when you go out and you get food stamps or, SNAP, the SNAP program, which is another word for food stamps, you go out there and spend that, you could basically go into a grocery store and buy whatever you want, save for...
Including Snapple?
Yeah, including Snapple, but you could save for like alcohol, and I think it's hot prepared meals. So you could technically go in there and just buy a bunch of soda or candy or cookies, and basically the taxpayer would be funding someone eating that diet. And so I think there's some Republicans on the Hill who are thinking, I think maybe we should limit that or make it so they can only buy certain items, or certain items would be covered by EBT. And then when you go to the checkout aisle, it wouldn't scan up and it wouldn't allow you to use those food stamps for sugary sodas. I think the whole idea of this got a little outsized attention on social media, on X, when you saw some conservative influencers blasting the idea of this, and it almost looked like they were all writing from the same script. And it was eventually revealed that indeed they were reading off of a script given to them by a marketing firm or a PR firm, presumably hired by Big Soda. And so there's a big mea culpa, I think, among some of these influencers, and a lot of angry reactions if you scrolled through. So I think that kind of brought more attention to the idea of it. Now, critics of it will say, on the left. It's kind of an interesting conundrum now because Democrats, those same liberals, don't really want to see any cuts to the food stamps program. So you're kind of having to pick and choose between the two. And I spoke to one guy who was saying at the Center of American Progress, I believe, and he was kind of saying, I think instead of curbing the use of soda or the ability to purchase soda through food stamps, we should tax it across the board so it treats it fairly.
Not just borne by the poor.
Yeah, not just poor people are the only ones who eat unhealthily. Maybe we should expand it to like a broader based tax. So I think this is something you might see get more attention this year in particular because Republicans are debating the tax bill, re-upping all those tax cuts and cutting some SNAP benefits is one of the ways to pay for it. I think it's going to largely be through work requirements, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see them kind of use this opportunity to perhaps try to put that in there, limit soda consumption.
And of course, there are a lot of Republicans that want a maha these days.
Yes, they do.
Thank you, Zach. You can read Zach and the rest of our policy team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.